That doesn't seem a conflict of interest at all. Or petitions or initiatives, hold rallies. These are all things, and in and of themselves, if we have a certain mindset while we're doing them, but if we think that these things are going to fix what's going on, well, they haven't so far. This is the route that keeps us in this cycle, that keeps things going the way that they have been going. And because of the mindset that it is, it's that we ask permission to exercise our own rights with this mindset. And so we have to do a paradigm shift of how we think about things. We have to understand that our rights come from God, and that it is we don't need to ask permission to exercise something that God already gave us permission to do. But when or if our rights are challenged, then we get into the aspect that we need to build understanding. So that way we can effectively, verbally exercise our rights, because most of the time, that's really all that it takes, and so we can do that as a first step. And then we build understanding in the community, and so that the community can then, and the culture accepts what the facts are, and what natural law is, and what our freedoms are, and so that when your freedoms are under attack and you want to have them defended, they back you up with that. And then we, of course, build our local communities where we can come together to be able to defend our rights, okay? So this is the paradigm shift that we need to make in our brains, but to be able to do this, I want to get into the foundations of Americanism, starting off with where do our rights come from? And it goes to the idea of the phrase that we find in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and of nature's God. And the idea of natural law has really, it's been lost in modern culture, where we want to look at where is that written, right? We want to say, okay, well, where was this written? And we're totally missing the point if we're looking for natural law to be written. But Ezra Taft Benson, in the book, The Proper Role of Government, he said, starting at the foundation of the pyramid, let us first consider the origin of those freedoms we have come to know as human rights. There are only two possible sources. Rights are either God-given as part of the divine plan, or they are granted by government as part of the political plan. Reason, necessity, tradition, and religious convictions all lead me to accept the divine origin of these rights. Now, if we accept the premise that human rights are granted by government, then we must be willing to accept the corollary that they can be denied by government. So we have to understand that our rights come from God and this is something that was very foundational, something that made America different from every other nation in the world. America was founded on the idea that our rights come from God and that government's role in the Declaration of Independence was to protect those rights. Whereas every other nation on the earth was based on the idea of the divine rights of kings, where your rights come from the government, and if he allows you to have a certain right, isn't that great? And if not, that's his right to take them away. And so it was a complete paradigm shift of our individual rights coming from God, and that to protect our rights, governments were instituted. And so this concept of rights existing, and then to protect those rights, we institute government to be able to have that limited duty. We see in the law by Frederick Bastiat, and we have some copies at the table. He says, life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. So we had these rights, but to be able to protect them, we couldn't just stand on our lawns all day long and make sure nobody was stealing our house. We delegated our authority, our God-given authority, to someone else to do something for us. So natural law, these things are included in natural law. Life, liberty, we have a natural right to life, liberty, and property. And natural law can't be legitimately changed by government. I'll give you an example. You have Sir Thomas More. This is during the period of inquisitions, and he was being held before the courts, and he said that some men say the earth is flat. Some men say the earth is round. But if it is flat, could Parliament make it round? And if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? So the earth is its shape no matter what the government says or what laws are passed by the government. In the 1800s, the state of Ohio actually tried to pass a law changing the definition of pi. You can't change natural law. No matter what government does, it doesn't change things. Now here's a couple of examples of natural law from, insert some humor in here from the movie Kindergarten Cop. Oh, wait. Shazad, where's the audio?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I need to go to the bathroom. Boys have a penis. Girls
Okay.
have a vagina.
Okay. Now, if you couldn't hear that, these are some things that are we see in today's world where they want to have the government change basic anatomy just because they passed a law. And this is something that won't change. And we see every day the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. What comes up will come down, right? Murder is wrong. Stealing is wrong. Damaging other people's property is wrong. These are all things that are basic foundational principles that no matter what government does, these things are still true. And to be able to protect our rights to life, liberty, and property, Benson gave a great presentation called Man, Freedom, and Government, where he explains our rights regarding what we have internally and our right to be able to delegate that duty to others. And so I'm going to play a clip from that video.
The individual citizens
Okay.
delegate to the sheriff their unquestionable right to protect themselves.
The
sheriff does for them
delegate to the
only
sheriff
what they
their
had a right to do
unquestionable
for
right to protect
themselves,
themselves.
nothing more.
The sheriff
Now let
does
us go a
for
step
them
further
only
in the question
what
of
they
man's
had a
right to
do
delegate power.
themselves, nothing more.
Suppose Pioneer
Let
A
us go a step
has
further
one horse.
in the question of
He
man's
also
right
wants
to
another
delegate.
horse, but does not have the money or other means to buy one. Pioneer B has 3 horses, and Pioneer A decides that he would like to share in his neighbor's good fortune. Is he entitled to take one of his neighbor's horses? Obviously not. If his neighbor wishes to give it or to lend it, that is another question. But so long as Pioneer B wishes to keep his property, A has no just claim to it. If A has no proper power to take B's property, he obviously cannot delegate any such power to the sheriff. Even if everyone in the community desires that B give his extra horse to A, they have no right individually or collectively to force him to do so. They cannot delegate a power they themselves do not have. No government can justly claim the power to seize and redistribute the people's wealth and property, or to force reluctant citizens to perform acts of charity against their will. Government is created by man, and no man possesses any such power to delegate to government.
If I don't have the power to do it, I can't delegate it to somebody else, all right? We want to get that into it. So we have these natural rights. We came together and we delegated certain powers to the sheriff to protect those rights.
What was that presentation again?
It's called Man, Freedom, and Government. The entire video is on YouTube. So when we think about these things, right, if I don't have something, I can't give it away. If I don't have a Lamborghini, I can't give you a Lamborghini, right? Same thing, right? We can't do these things. And so in the Constitution, we the people delegated certain powers to the federal government. And so if the federal government exercises power that they weren't given, they are nothing but a common thief. They've stolen powers that they don't have. And if I don't have a power, I can't delegate to the government. So if the government's doing something, A, we haven't delegated to them, they're thieves. If they've grabbed something, a power that we don't even have the authority to give them, again, they're thieves grabbing authority that they don't have. And they need to be treated as such, these common thieves. In the Declaration of Independence, there was a list, it was a list of things that the government was doing, that the crown, the king was doing, that was violating actually the British Constitution. And when they would do this, this is one of the complaints they had, was that the king was giving his assent to the Parliament's act of pretend legislation. The Parliament was acting as a common thief, passing laws they were not authorized to do. And so when you broke one of these pretend laws, then you would be tried for these pretend offenses. And that's what they were, and that's what we need to understand. The Founding Fathers understood that with the Parliament and the British Constitution. We need to understand that with our own government, that when our state legislature, when our city governments, when our federal government goes beyond its delegated powers, what they're doing is they're passing pretend legislation. And the power given to them in the Constitution is very limited. In the Federalist Papers, which were documents that were published to be able to help the American people understand the Constitution, Madison said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. It is to be remembered that the general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated or listed objects. Okay, they have a limited amount of things that they're allowed to do. They go beyond these 17 enumerated powers. They are breaking the law. They are acting illegally, and this is pretend legislation, and they need to be treated as the common thieves that they are. Okay? So again, the Declaration of Independence says that the king has combined with others to subject us to jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. That's, again, that same idea that the people were being subjected to laws that they weren't authorized to do. And so this was pretend legislation. So we go to the 10th Amendment that helps us to remember that, yes, it is a fact that the Constitution limits the powers given to the federal government by saying that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. Okay, so again, it's reminding them that if we didn't specifically list a power, you don't have that power. You cannot do it. And James Madison asked, this idea that if they could do more than that, for what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? So he was explaining that that just because we wouldn't list these certain things that you could do if you could do whatever you wanted. Of course, these things were limited. And the powers that were delegated by the Constitution to the federal government, right? We're delegating, we're giving power to the government, and these powers are few and defined. They're listed. It is to be remembered that the general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects. Thomas Jefferson reminded us in the Kentucky resolutions, because even just a few years after the Constitution was ratified, they noticed that the general government was already violating the compact that they had entered into. So he said, what do we do about that when they go beyond those limited powers? He said the several states who formed that instrument, being sovereign and independent, we are still sovereign and independent nations, these states, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction. It's the state's job, not the court's job, it's the state's job to judge when the Constitution has been violated. And that a nullification by those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. So it's our job, because we're the ones that gave the government these powers, to decide when the powers that we gave them were violated. And then if we see that they were violated, it's our job then to make sure that we don't comply with those laws. It's to nullify those laws. James Madison said, along the same lines, there can be no tribunal above the state's authority to decide in the last resort would the compact made by them be violated. So we'll see state legislators or the governor regularly say, well, yeah, we don't like what the federal government's doing anyways, and so we'll take them to court and we'll sue them to decide if it's constitutional or not. And then, like with Obamacare, it was ruled constitutional, nothing we can do about it. The people that wrote the Constitution said, no, that is not how it is. The final arbiter is not the Supreme Court. The final arbiter, the final decider of the violation of the Constitution is, of course, the entity that created it. The creator is always greater than the created. So what are we to do? We nullify, right? So I'm going to give you an example of one of the states Connecticut did when they noticed a statute passed by the Congress that was a violation of the Constitution. They said that resolved that to preserve the Union, so nullification is not an act of war, it's an effort to preserve the Union and support the Constitution of the United States. It becomes the duty of the legislator of the states in such a crisis of affairs vigilantly to watch over and vigorously to maintain the powers not delegated to the United States. So it's their job, right, in these things, is to watch over. Their job isn't just to kind of focus on, hey, what are we doing here in our state? Their job is to make sure that the government that they created is sticking within its bounds. But to the states respectively, or to the people, and that a due regard to this duty, meaning preserving the Union, will not permit this assembly to assist the aforesaid unconstitutional act. A lot of people that are naysayers of the founders' solution will say, no, that nullification leads to division. It will lead to anarchy. It will lead to chaos. It will lead to the dissolving of the Union. They'll say, well, that's what the war between the states was about. But they understood in the beginning of our nation that no, the states being a check on the federal government was what would preserve the Union. So that was the Connecticut General Assembly in 1809. And then we go to 1832, the Supreme Court case of Worcester versus Georgia, and the Supreme Court ruled against Georgia. So did the state legislature and the governor of Georgia say, oh, there's nothing I can do about it? You know, the judges, they ruled that this was... No, what they did was they passed a law that said anyone that comes to Georgia to enforce the court ruling will be hung. Okay, so they did a step forward of not just saying we're not going to participate. Their version of nullification was, if you come in here to enforce this illegal law, we're going to hang you. Okay? So, also, if somebody that says that nullification is not the right answer, we go to the example of Alexander Donovan. When he was commanded to kill the prophet Joseph, he said that it is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. And if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God. Okay? So Alexander Donovan didn't say, well, I've just got to, I'm just following orders. I'll let the courts, that's there. It's above my pay grade. I'm going to let them decide, what's right and what's wrong. No, he had a conscience. He knew what was right and what was wrong, and he said that he is not going to be a part of it, and that he said that he was going to hold others accountable if they decided to break the natural rights and the natural law of others, okay? And so, going again in Utah here, Brigham Young, he explained the same principle the founding fathers taught, that an exercise of a power not granted in the Constitution is unlawful. Okay? Again, this is a pretend legislation. We don't just say, did the courts decide? Did Congress decide? You've heard people say that, oh, well, if Congress decided and the president didn't veto it and the courts didn't rule it, then it's automatically constitutional. No, we are the judge of this. In fact, John Taylor explained, then do I profess to ignore the laws of the land? No, not unless they are unconstitutional. Then I would do it all the time. So, of course, we would break the laws that are not constitutional. This is what it means to nullify. And then the first presidency of the church in 1886 said that God is superior to governments and courts, but he tells his church to befriend the constitutional law of the land. Okay, so we have these two dichotomies. God is superior, but we're supposed to obey the law of the land. If it is not constitutional, he says, it comes of evil, and it must support the principle of freedom, meaning the law must support the principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, and if not, then it comes of evil. Whatever is contrary to the freedom guaranteed by the Constitution, which includes not mere belief, but the free exercise of religion, he does not command his people to obey, but says they shall do his will. So the first presidency came out and officially said that if a law is violating the Constitution and the delegated powers in there, then you don't have to obey. But of course, sometimes it can be scary. And so, when we're going against the big bad government and we're saying, you know what, we're not going to go along with this. And so there's a principle that we're going to be talking about a lot, but I want to introduce a little bit right now with the story, this account that happened to the prophet Joseph. It's the important principle of standing with others. Too often, especially in the crowd that says, of limited government, is we're individualists and we want to do things on our own. But that's not very effective. We can't do this on our own. So, Joseph tells the story of this time he was a prisoner of a sheriff in Ottawa. This is in Illinois. And that they stopped for the night. And that the sheriff of Lee County came to my assistance and slept by me. In the morning, certain men wished to see me, but I was not allowed to see them. The news of my arrival had hastily circulated about the neighborhood, and very early in the morning, the largest room in the hotel was filled with citizens who were anxious to hear me preach and requested me to address them. Okay? So he's the prisoner of the sheriff. They've come to this town. Everybody in town wants to hear him speak. They've all congregated in the local hotel. And the sheriff says, pointing to Joseph, I wish you to understand this man is my prisoner, and I want you should disperse. You must not gather around here in this way. Everybody get out of here. This isn't going to go on. Upon which an aged gentleman, who was lame, carried a large hickory walking stick, advanced towards Reynolds, bringing his hickory upon the floor. So he bangs his cane on the floor and says, "You damned infernal puke. We'll learn you to come here and interrupt gentlemen. Sit down there," pointing to a very low chair, "and sit still. Don't open your head till General Smith gets through talking." Can you imagine? You cannot kidnap men here. If you do in Missouri, and if you attempt it here, there's a committee in this grove that will sit on your case, and sir, it is the highest tribunal in the United States, as from its decision, there is no appeal. Reynolds, no doubt aware that the person addressing him was the head of a committee who had prevented the settlers on the public domain from being imposed upon by land settlers, sat down in silence while he addressed the assembly for an hour and a half. Okay, so this was a case of nullification. The elected official came in and said, "You're not allowed to do this," and they said, "No. We have the right to hear this man speak, and we will hear this man speak, and because we are the highest tribunal." These committees, this is the community, right? You have the president, you have the Congress, you have the courts, you have the legislature, you have the sheriff, which is supposed to be, right? He's the last elected official. But what if all these guys are violating your rights like the Sheriff Reynolds was? We have our community. We delegated to the government their authority. They exist because of the consent of the governed. They withdrew their consent. It is our right to withdraw our consent when they are violating natural law. And they stood together so that they could defend these rights, and the sheriff recognized the power in these people that they were going to stand together, and they let Joseph speak. So there's a myth, right? I mentioned earlier that, nullification, all this stuff was settled in the war between the states. Well, Abraham Lincoln didn't agree with this. He said, but if the policy of the government upon a vital question affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the moment they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own masters. So, even at this point in our history, we understood that if we allowed the courts to be the final arbiter of what's constitutional and what's not, as opposed to the people that delegated the authority to these people, then we were no longer our masters, but we were going to be ruled by this black-robed oligarchy. And nullification didn't stop in the 1860s. They continued on. So I want to give some examples of what we can see, real-life examples that we can all start to practice on, because we can't start big. It's like exercising muscles, right? We have to be strong enough, either as an individual or as a community, to be able to do it. So I want to show some examples, and then we can get into this. So we have John Taylor. He said, I defy the United States, right? I'm going to break the laws all the time when they violate the Constitution. The Underground Railroad, it was illegal to harbor fugitive slaves, but people said, you know what, this is immoral, and I'm going to be a part of actually helping them. We have the Real ID. This was there were 21 states that said we weren't going to be a part of this. And you have the state of Utah that nullified marijuana laws, right? Because this goes back to the fundamental principle that we see of we the people. We the people give the government these enumerated powers. And when they violate that, we have the right, and we notice that. And it's a natural inclination of people to do this. It's an unnatural thing to say, no, we have to do whatever these people say. If we're a free country, that's not how this works. But this is not an excuse to just do whatever we want. This isn't libertinism where we just do whatever we want and chaos ensues. And if we want to take from somebody, then we can do that. If we want to hurt somebody else, then we can do that. That's not what that means. Has to be within the bounds of course, natural law. Those things that we delegated to government to protect our rights. So in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord actually lays out this principle for us. Section 98. How do we judge if a law is constitutional or not? It says, the Lord says, and that law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Okay? So, and that law of the land, which is constitutional. So then we have the comma, and he defines it. The definition of constitutional for the Lord is a law that supports principles of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges. Very simple. You don't need to have, look through all kinds of thousands of pages of case law. The Lord puts it right here. And this belongs to all mankind and is justifiable. So, and as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this, more or less than supporting principles of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, comes of evil. That's straight from the Lord's mouth. We can understand that anything more or less than supporting principles of freedom and rights and privileges is evil. Okay, now we go to verse 11, where the Lord tells us, well, what do we do with such a law that is evil? He says, and I give unto you a commandment that ye shall forsake all evil. Okay? More or less than this cometh of evil, and I give you a commandment to forsake all evil. A law that's more or less than this, we forsake it. So what does that mean to forsake? I want to go back because over time, the definition of words, our understanding of words changes. So we go to the 1830 dictionary and its definition of forsake. It says the first definition is to quit or leave entirely, to desert, to abandon, to depart from, to abandon, to renounce, to reject, to leave, withdraw from. In Scripture, God forsakes his people when he withdraws his aid or the light of his countenance. So when we read the Scriptures and the Lord tells us to forsake a law that is more or less than this is what it means. And so we need to ask ourselves when we look at a law, right? Is it constitutional? So a principle, right? If we can't give the government something that we don't have ourselves, we need to ask ourselves, number one, is the government authorized to make this law in the Constitution, the federal Constitution, the state Constitution? Did the people in the state or in the states authorize that level of government to do this thing. Federal government has 17 enumerated powers. We look at this law. Does it fit within those 17 enumerated powers? That's the first question. And if the answer is no, then it's easy. We just forsake it. Number two, the next question we ask ourselves, if we were to do the same thing the government is doing, would I get in trouble with the government? Okay, that's this law that's being in place, right? Some law says, I'm going to take from him and give to you. Do I have the authority to do that? Okay, if I did that same thing, I would go to jail as a thief and a robber. Therefore, if I can't do it, if I would get into trouble, then I can't delegate that authority to the government. Therefore, it's more or less than this, and I forsake it. Number two, does obeying this law violate my conscience? Even if I wouldn't get in trouble doing what the government's doing, I have to ask myself, would it even violate my conscience, right? Because just because a law is passed doesn't mean it's moral, and even if it's not passed doesn't mean it's not immoral. So we need to look at this and say, does it violate my personal conscience? And if it does, we forsake it. Okay? Now, this idea of forsaking laws, it's not really ingrained in our culture. We have this idea, and it's still ingrained in you, that we obey the laws of the land, that we do whatever the government says. I encourage you, please go to the Defending Utah YouTube channel and watch our documentary on the 12th article of faith in Romans 13, what its original meaning was and how we can apply it and under original intent. So this idea of breaking the law, very strange to a lot of people, but there's actually been studies written that find that you, the average person, commits 3 felonies every single day. Now, we're not talking about like driving infractions. We're talking about, pretty serious laws, a felony. Almost everybody in here committed 3 felonies today. Pretty sure we didn't do it on purpose. And so that's what I'm asking you to do when we talk about nullification. If we're going to break the law anyways, we should do it with intent. Okay? So how do we nullify? I'm going to give some examples again. We have the Georgia law, right? They nullified. They said, if you do this, we're going to hang you. Just in 2010, Ohio, they nullified Obamacare's personal mandate before the courts did anything and before Congress did anything. They were the first ones. They said in the state of Ohio, you are not going to get in trouble for not getting health insurance. They nullified that portion of Obamacare. In 2009, the state of Arizona, with 21 other states, they said, no, we're not going to follow the national ID card. Congress passed the bill that said every state has to have be a part of our national ID system. The state of Arizona said, no, we're not going to do that. And Utah, just a couple of years ago, said, who cares about federal government's anti-marijuana laws? We're going to nullify them and make marijuana at least medically legal in our state. Okay? So these are some examples of states nullifying. Our state legislature, even though they fight against it, they have the authority and the right and the obligation to nullify unconstitutional acts of the federal government. Okay, but sometimes our elected officials don't always do the right thing. I know, that's shocking, but sometimes it happens. And so we have to take this power and authority on ourselves, because ultimately all of what the government does, it rests on our shoulders. We're responsible for our acts in relation to government and how those laws are instituted. That's Doctrine and Covenants 134, verse 1. And so we have to take personal responsibility. So I want to go throughout history of examples of people taking that responsibility on themselves and personally nullifying a law that was passed by a level of government. We go back to the Old Testament, and we have Daniel. They passed a law saying you could not pray to any god but the God of the land. And it would have been easy for Daniel to just privately nullify it and just go in his closet so nobody saw him. And he's like, I'm going to do this thing because it's the right thing to do, but I'm not going to let anybody see me. He could have done that, but he didn't. He was bold. He went to the window and he prayed out loud so that everyone could see and hear him defying the law, willing to take that consequence amongst themselves. Same with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They defied the government to a point where they were actually thrown in the fiery furnace, and they were protected. But that doesn't happen every time. You have Abinadis that stand up against the government, and sometimes it's their time to die. But they were willing to suffer the consequence of nullification because it was the right thing to do morally. Another example, right? It was the law of the land to turn your child over to Herod and have him killed. Mary and Joseph didn't do that with the Savior. The Savior came and turned over the money changers' tables and violated, and destroyed their property because they were violating laws. When Rome made Christianity completely illegal, punishable by death, did the author of Romans 13, did he say, well, we got to subject ourselves to laws and do whatever the government says? No. He says, not only, go ahead and kill me, but kill me upside down because I'm not worthy to suffer the same consequence as the Savior. They did not just submit to whatever the government said. They were willing to take a stand, and they were willing to take the consequence of taking that stand. Now we fast forward to more modern times. When the government passed illegal laws against the people of Utah, instead of submitting, doesn't George Buchanan believe in obeying the laws of the land? Well, of course he did, but if they were constitutional. And so he was willing to suffer the consequence. Fast forward to the 1900s. Rosa Parks, nullified. The law was if you were on a government bus and you were black, you had to sit at the back. She said, no, I'm going to sit at the front, and suffered the consequence. Now we fast forward again to last spring when the government, our governor, declared an emergency. And because of this emergency, your right to assembly was taken away. So what did we do? We immediately got more than 10 people together and congregated on the steps of the Capitol. And we broke the law, this illegal, this pretend legislation of the governor. When they said that the restaurants were shut down, we went to restaurants and we ate. And in fact, when they were forced to shut down, we were looking for businesses that were willing to stand up for their rights. And you can't force somebody to take their rights. And so it was difficult because people were afraid. But we were able to find one restaurant in American Fork, Tangie's. They said, yeah, if you'll back us up, we will open up. And so that day, with a 2-hour time period, we filled the restaurant, no masks, no physical separation, and there was 300 people within this restaurant within a couple of hours. And in this junction, the state health department didn't produce any fines for them, and they just said, you know what, and they were able to stand on their rights and our rights to assemble. Also, during this time, when still things were closed down, we weren't allowed to be in groups of greater than 20 people. We got together. We had video showings. We had meetings like this, where we had over hundreds of people in attendance in defiance of the law. There was something else even more controversial that we were engaged in. I'm going to show a little clip of a video about this.
In a world of masks, who is left to defend your rights? They came from the farthest reaches of the Wasatch Front. They did the unthinkable. But they're going to do it again, and again, and again. In a world.
So, another thing, how do we nullify? Personal nullification again. The legislature this last year, they passed a law, it was just totally outrageous, that said that you did not have your right to free speech. You're not allowed to protest in front of special people's houses. And so what did we do? We found government officials' houses and we said, what you're doing is illegal and wrong, and we're not going to stand for it. Okay, so let me look at other examples. You compare it to sin. When you resist sin, right, that's a form of nullification. You're nullifying the temptation. So what do these examples have in common? Okay? You resist, you say, no this, I'm not going to do this. You're doing nothing. So it's actually easier to not comply than to comply. Right? Compliance takes effort. We comply with the DMV or licensing laws, right? Compliance with it takes effort. Okay? It's easier to nullify. You're just living your life the way you would, doing the right thing, not hurting other people. And so we really need to flip the paradigm of our rights do not come from government. We do not beg them for our rights. We exercise them. And we do that, and we do it effectively, not just by doing whatever we want, but we have to build understanding in ourselves so that we know what our rights are. And we build understanding in our community so they will defend us and they will not go against us. We have the culture, and we stand together to defend our rights, right? So some things that we need to remember, though, when we do this, okay? We can't do this without education. Not just education. We can memorize the Constitution, but if we don't understand it, it doesn't do us any good. We have to understand these things. So we have to build our understanding, okay? And also, we can't do this and expect not to get into trouble. We have to be willing. If we want the blessings of those of old, we have to be willing to take the risks of those of old. Right? We have the founding fathers that they swore, that they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to do the right thing. If they had lost, they all would have been hung for treason. They broke the law. And even though they won, they still weren't without consequence. 5 of the signers, they were captured by the British and they were tortured as traitors. 9 of them fought in the Revolutionary War and died from their wounds. 2 lost their sons in the war, and 2 others had their sons captured. And at least a dozen of them had their homes pillaged and burned. So when we do the right thing, right, we're not just thinking, hey, we just need to stay, these are our rights, and the government's going to be like, oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I didn't realize I was breaking the law. Of course, they know what they're doing. Right? Our forefathers were willing to take the risks that were associated with doing what was right. Heber J. Grant said that no matter what restrictions we are placed under by men, our only consistent course is to keep the commandments of God. We should, in this regard, place ourselves in the same position as that of the 3 Hebrews who were cast into the fiery furnace. Okay? We can't be scared. We can't expect our freedoms without taking the risk, because the people that we're dealing with are thieves. They're criminals, and they're breaking their own oaths to do what they're doing. So of course there's going to be risk. We have to be willing to take that risk. But also, right, we have to be organized. It's very easy that if I, by myself, do something, it's going to be easy for them to just take me out. But if we all in this room were unified on the same principle, and they wanted to arrest me for giving this presentation tonight, it'd be very difficult. If we were all unified and we said, no, we're not going to allow you to arrest Ben. They wouldn't have the power to do so without causing even more problems. We're able to do it, just like with the sheriff and the prophet Joseph, recognizing the authority of the committees. They were able to build the understanding, and so that their rights were protected. And so to do this, we encourage you to become a part of defending Utah. Following this example, right? When the founding fathers formed the Constitution, they didn't just get together in a room and said, hey, this sounds good, let's do this. They looked throughout history of mankind and said, what governments, when were people free? And what were governments allowed to do and not allowed to do? What happened in these governments that allowed these people to be free? And they put all these things, and what caused governments to fall over time and to become from free republics to, like Rome, becoming an empire? How do we prevent this from happening? And so at Defending Utah, we followed that same example. What are the ways that people throughout history have and have not been able to regain lost freedom or preserve freedom before it gets taken? Well, to follow that history. And so because of that, we've been able to have a lot of success. There was a man in Provo that was defending his property against trespassers. And instead of, when the trespassers actually called the police, people on his property without his permission, they called the police, and the police, instead of arresting the trespassers, arrested the homeowner. And when his first lawyer said, just take a plea deal and just take it from 2 felonies down to 1, that's the best you can expect to get. He said no, and he found another lawyer that was willing to help him out because he was in a serious trouble, and because he was in court. And we interviewed him, and we talked about his case. And in the interview on the radio, we talked about how the jury's job is not just to judge guilt or innocence, but to judge the justness of the law. So we covered jury nullification as well in this interview. And this individual's lawyer actually played this program in the courtroom and interviewing the jurors afterwards, because the jury actually found him, even though the lawyer said, yes, he's broken the law, but it's unjust, and you need to find him not guilty. So they found him not guilty. And after interviewing some of the jurors, the individual found that it was because even though they were anti-gun, they were compelled that it was wrong what the government was doing, and so they had to vote not guilty. Okay? Also, the state's vaccination opt-out form. It used to say that you admitted that you were harming your child by not vaccinating them and to opt them out to go to government school. We got involved, and we were able to get the pressure and get them to change the language of this so that you were no longer incriminating yourself by signing this form. And also there were several different expansion bills in the state legislature that we were able to stop the creation of a vaccine database several years ago. We caused the state legislator that was promoting Agenda 21 to not only be removed from his positions in the legislative committees and be fired from the organization that he founded, forced him not to run for office again. Also, and all the different liberty organizations in Utah, we have more viewers, more subscribers than anybody else. In fact, we had higher ratings than the local ABC affiliate recently. And Count My Vote, if you guys remember, we talked about this last month, the Count My Vote battle. There was the Republican Party their lawyer was throwing the case, basically. They were consistently filing reports and filing papers seconds after the deadline. Happened so many times that the judge actually threatened to fine their lawyer in contempt. We were able to uncover what was really going on behind the scenes with Count My Vote. In fact, one of the people that founded Count My Vote was placed as the arbiter to help settle disputes between both sides. And we told the head of the Constitution Party what was going on, and he got the Constitution Party lawyer involved, and they said, oh, that's all that we have to do? Okay, we got rid of the arbiter, and we'll just file the reports, and they did that and that, and so the only victory in the Count My Vote battle is because of the information that we were able to get to interested parties in that case. We have big events. A lot of people are interested in our things. We've got access to radio programs to help get our word out. And we have lots of great liberty individuals and organizations that back us. We have elected officials all over the state in different positions. Also, we've been able to lead. We're not just by ourselves. We believe that there are a lot of good groups and good individuals out there. We want to work with them. And so there's been several cases where we've been able to work together and lead this effort to be able to stop bad legislation. And so when we get discouraged sometimes, though, we think that we're the only ones in this room that are that understand these things. And this was something that Samuel Adams, one of the founding fathers, believed that had people tell him as well. He said, though, that they had to educate on principles and not just on issues. Okay? We talk about issues like the masks or the shutdowns. Those are issues. Or like Obamacare, that's an issue. He said, no, we have to understand the principles behind those. Otherwise, when a new issue comes up, if we don't understand the principle, we're not going to understand that our rights are being violated and what we have to do. And so he understood to be able to build a free people that we had to lay the foundation. Sometimes we really get impatient. We think, well, we don't have time. We just have to do it now. And this is just not the case. When we get in a hurry, we actually make things worse, right? If we're just in a hurry, we want to build a house and we just get a rush job done and we don't do a real good job, it's not a very safe house. If you have a recipe and you're trying to bake something and you get a rush job and you don't do things in the right order, you're going to ruin the recipe. Same thing for liberty. If we think that we don't have the time and we lose our patience and we want to skip the building understanding and building community aspect of it, and we think we can either do it by ourselves or we think we can just go hide in the hills and just wait it all out, we are missing the point, and we're going to have the same effect that we've had for the last 200 years. Said Samuel Adams did not lose heart on this, though. Yet people come to him and say that the people are dead, and the dead cannot be raised without a miracle. Even at this point in our history, there were people that thought there were not enough good, liberty-minded people out there. But Samuel Adams did not stand for this. He says, all are not dead, and where there is a spark of patriotic fire, we will rekindle it. He was not willing to accept that there's only 2 or 3 people left. And so he got together. Him and 8 of his buddies formed a group called the Loyal 9, which turned into the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Safety throughout the colonies. So our nation's independence literally started with Sam Adams and 8 of his buddies. Okay? We've got more than 8 people in this room, so we're in a better position to restore liberty in America than Sam Adams was in 1776. So we should not lose heart. We should not give up. We should be rededicated and realize that there are solutions that aren't being presented to us by the mainstream media and by mainstream politicians, because they actually work. Because the things that we talk about actually have an impact. So I want to invite you all today to go to defendingutah.org and go and click on the Learn tab. Start there. We have tons of different videos and articles and audio downloads for you to be able to better build your own understanding. And then go to defendingutah.org and click on the Join tab and become a member today. Become a part of the community. Become a part of the solution so that you can stand with your neighbor to be able to restore lost liberty. Thank you.